My name is Lalu Davies Yemerton, and you're listening to My Brother Podcast.
It is better to be prepared for an opportunity and not have one than to have an opportunity and not be prepared. That was a quote by Whitney M. Young, former president of the National Urban League. My guest today is all too familiar with the National Urban League. He's had a historic career as a civil rights activist, a civic leader, and a corporate leader. Johnny Jacob, thank you so much for making yourself available for this interview, Brother Jacob. I'd like us to get right into it. And if you just start us off with a short synopsis on your background, and, I couldn't even, I'm even tepid about saying make it a short synopsis, but to the degree you can make it a short synopsis on what's been just an incredible journey so far.
Well, let me just begin by saying that I grew up in that town where you are today in Houston, Texas, during the early 30s, 40s, and 50s. I was born in a little town called Trout, Louisiana, but my parents moved to Houston when I was less than 2, so I know nothing about where I was born. But as we moved into Houston, my memory is that we moved into instant poverty. I grew up on Pierce Avenue between Live Oak and St. Charles in a 3-room shack, 2513 and a half Pierce Avenue. We were so poor, we only had the PO. We couldn't even have the old ARA. And no gas, no electricity. Read by kerosene lamp. I heated the house by wood stoves and heaters. But I had outstanding parents who were big Christians who loved people and loved life and loved their children. And my father ran his house by a set of rules. My father said, if you live in this house, you got to be in school. If you're not in school, you got to have a job. If you get a girl pregnant, you're going to marry her. And if you go to jail, you're going to stay. He said, now you got the rules. And he said, I may not have ever gone to college, but I know the difference between an A and a C. Don't bring me any C's. And so that was the environment in which I grew up. And even though we were poor, we were never desperate. I mean, I always had a roof over my head. We always had some food. I may not have had the nice clothes that other kids had, but they were clean. And so when I went to school, I made a decision about myself. In my day, the only boys generally who went to college were the good athletes. And they played sports to get a scholarship to go to college, to graduate and get a job. Because that was before the NFL and the NBA were taking in black ball players. So the athletes in my day were scholar athletes, and they worked to get scholarships to go to college, to get degrees, to get jobs. Well, all I had to do was look in the mirror, and I saw that I was too small to play football, too short to play basketball, not the fastest guy on the track. And while I was a pretty good second baseman, it was the only position I could play because I didn't have a great arm. So I made a decision right then that I would just work at being smart. And so I just worked at being smart. Now, the great thing about being smart in those days is kids liked you when you were smart. They didn't care that you were poor. They liked you because you were smart, and their parents liked you. So I got included in some things simply because I was known as that little smart John Jacob. And as I moved through school, and you got to remember, these were segregated days and segregated years in Houston. Because I graduated from high school a year before Brown v. Board of Education integrating schools was passed. But I just worked at being smart. The year before I was to graduate from high school, an old white real estate magnate died by the name of E.E. Worthen. There's a school named after him in Houston right now.
Yes.
E.E. Worthen died, but he left $500,000 in a scholarship trust fund for poor but bright Black kids. When I saw the article in the paper, I said, I just got to college. I said, my challenge for the next 12 months are 1, I got to stay alive, and 2, I got to practice acting surprised for when they call my name. And when they called my name at the commencement, I gave them an Academy Award performance. I got this scholarship. And the only school that I had heard of more than once was Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, because the colleges in Texas were all segregated. And Black teachers in those days would teach all year, but in the summer, they would leave the state to go work on graduate degrees. And one of the teachers in my high school had worked on a graduate degree at Northwestern. So Northwestern was the only school I had heard of more than once. So it's the only school I applied to. It's the only school I was accepted to. That summer, I worked 5 different little jobs, getting ready to go to college. Bought my first suit, bought my first overcoat, bought a ticket to Evanston, Illinois. My brother went to the pawn shop and bought a suitcase. Somebody gave me a trunk. And so my father made hangers for the trunk. So I was literally packed to go to Northwestern in September of 1953. When I was out cutting the grass of one of my former teachers, and he saw me and he came out and he said, Jacob, where are you going to college? And I said, Northwestern. And he gave me a funny look. I said, what? He said, well, you have enough money to get through your first 2 years. What are you going to do about your second 2 years? Well, when they gave me the scholarship, they said I could go to any school I wanted to. My father never earned $4,000 a year in his entire life. So I thought this was all the money in the world. And then when this teacher said to me that I only had enough money for 2 years, and I knew I couldn't go home and ask my parents for 2 years of money, I panicked. But one of the other little gigs I had was at the YWCA. And I went around to the Y, and one of the counselors there, a lady by the name of Geneva Bolton, she's Geneva Bolton Johnson now, saw me. And she saw this evidently pain look that I was carrying on my face. And she asked me what was wrong. And I told her what this teacher had said. And she said, let me try something. She went to her office. She sent a telegram to Howard University about me. Howard sent me a telegram and told me to come on. That's how I got to Howard. I just cashed in my Evanston, Illinois ticket, got a ticket to Washington, D.C., and ended up at Howard University. That's my story.
Wow, fantastic, wonderful. I was wondering when you said Northwestern, because I've obviously read your bio, and I was like, I wonder how the Howard connection ultimately occurred. So you've given a wonderful synopsis as to sort of your background and upbringing. So I'll have us just take us through late that summer. You make it up to Howard. What happens next in that next phase of your journey?
Well, I get to Howard. And when I got to Howard, see, when I left Houston, I had never seen a Black lawyer. I had only seen one Black physician, and I had only seen one Black dentist. I mean, my world was Third Ward because I only went places I could walk. My parents never owned a car, never owned a house. So I never really knew Houston other than places I could walk. So I get to Howard and I see all of these young Black students walking around in white coats. and they were in medical school and dental school. And I knew I had to go to college, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do when I got to college. I didn't know how you pick a major. And so I just started trying to be a good student. And one of the things that I was impressed with my first year is that I noticed the fraternities and sororities on campus. And the one that impressed me the most was Kappa Alpha Psi. And Kappa impressed me because they were the student leaders on Howard's campus. They were president of this, they were president of that, they were good students. And Kappa at Howard, most of the kids who attended Howard who lived in the city, most of the city guys pledged Howard. And so I was impressed with Howard because of his leadership. I was impressed with Kappa because of its leadership position on campus. And so I pledged Kappa. My sophomore year, principally because I had pledged Kappa, I became the sophomore class representative on the student council. My junior year, I became president of the junior class. My junior year, I became vice promarch of the fraternity. And so I began to assume a leadership position on campus. And I was just taking courses because I did not know how you select an area that you wanted to be entered into. Keep in mind that growing up in Houston, there were no Black business people. A business person in Houston when I was growing up was the guy who had the barbershop, the guy who had the service station, or the guy who managed the Black theater for the white owners. Those were the business people I knew. So I didn't know anything about business. I'd only seen one Black doctor. I had never seen a Black lawyer. So I just started taking courses. I woke up one day and I had 12 hours of economics. And I said to myself, you can't afford to waste any hours because you've got to be out of here in 4 years. And so I just decided to major in economics. I mean, I had no theoretical framework for why, other than I had 12 hours of it. And so I majored in economics, but I also got involved in ROTC. And as I moved through Howard, when I graduated in 1957, I was also commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, which brings me to one of the principles that I've always tried to be guided by. And that is, wherever you find yourself, try to make an impact. Try to impact wherever you find yourself. And so when I graduated and I with a degree in one hand and my commission in the other, I set off for active duty in the United States Army as a young second lieutenant. Now, I was a second lieutenant, 22 years old, but I looked about 16. So I had to figure out, how do you impact your position when you're in the Army and you have all these older guys who old as your father that you're supposed to be commanding? And I discovered that if you jumped out of an airplane, if you became airborne, they would respect you as being a true soldier. And so I signed up to go airborne. Well, first of all, you needed to weigh 120 pounds in order to qualify. I only weighed 117. So I had to plead with the doctor to give me 3 pounds so I could go and jump out of airplanes, so I could have a respected position in the military. So I did, completed that, and ended up my tour in the Army, and I returned to Washington, D.C. to look for a job. Washington is the worst place in the world to go to look for a job if you really need a job. Because in those days, everything is government. So, and the scheme is you've got to first find the exam you want to take. Then you take the exam. Then you wait to see if you pass the exam. And if you pass the exam, you wait to be called. And then finally you go to work. So I go back to DC, principally the lady that I started dating in college, my junior year, and penned her my senior year, and got engaged when I went on active duty, when I came on leave for Christmas. We had planned to get married, so I went back to DC because she was there and because I needed a job. And so I was scrounging around trying to find a job in DC. And I was living in the Kappa house because when I returned from active duty, I had no place to live. So I moved into the fraternity house. And I was living in a house looking for a job. And the great thing about fraternity, at least my fraternity and the days that I was doing this, everybody in the frat house were trying to help me find a job. And one day, a couple of guys who had gone to Chicago, which was their home, and had returned back to the Kappa house, they said to me, "Hey, Jake, there's a little company in Chicago that's hiring. I think you might want to check it out." So I wrote them a letter. And I told them that I had a degree in economics. I was fresh off the active duty. I was an officer and a gentleman. I was airborne all the way. That if you're looking for my kind of leadership, I would like to be considered for a position in your company. They sent me a telegram inviting me for an interview. But I needed to get to Chicago and I didn't have any money. I was sitting down in the basement of the fraternity house one night, because there was a brother who had just finished Harvard Law School, who had stopped off in DC to take the DC bar on his way to active duty. And he was having a party to celebrate. He had just finished having finished taking the bar. And I was sitting down at the bar at his party. And there were a couple of girls there who learned that I needed to get to Chicago for an interview. And one of them was married to a fraternity brother of mine, and she was from Houston. So she came over to me and she said, "I understand you need to get to Chicago." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Why don't I talk with my girlfriend who just bought a new car? And the two of us, if I can get her to do this, the two of us will ride to Chicago with you so you can go for your interview." So I said, "Great." So now I got a car to get to Chicago, but I still don't have any money. Another fraternity brother of mine, a guy by the name of Chester Wilson, heard this conversation. Chester was my roommate in the frat house. He came over to me and he said, "Jakey, I know you need to get to Chicago. Take this." Gave me his last $40 to get to Chicago. So now I have $40, a Gulf credit card, two girls who own a car, and no place to stay once I get to Chicago. Another brother hears this conversation. He calls a brother in Chicago, and tells them that I need to get to Chicago and I need a place to stay. Put me up for the night. He agrees to do it. So the next day I take off with these two girls. I got $40, a Gulf credit card. I get on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. There are no Gulf gas stations on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So I had to nurse my $40 to get me to Chicago and back. Fortunately, in those days, gas was only 25, 30 cents a gallon. So my $40 would get me there. So we get to Chicago. I knock on this guy's door, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. He takes one look at me with these two girls. And he says to me, "I tell you what, I'll give you my place for the night. I'll go over and spend the night with my mother. And just tomorrow when you leave, close my door." So the next day, I get up, I go for my interview. I walk in the door, and I tell this receptionist, I'm John Jacob. And she says, you're not John Jacob. I said, I'm John Jacob. She said, you're not John Jacob. I said, I'm John Jacob. She said, you're not John Jacob. Now she's panicking, and she's backing up, and she backs up through this door. I hear all this scurrying going around in the back. A guy finally comes out, and he spends almost 2 hours explaining to me why I don't want to work for them. I mean, he's saying things like, oh, our representatives have to be able to go into places like Georgia and Alabama. I said, I don't mind going into Georgia and Alabama. In fact, I just left Georgia. I was stationed in Georgia. He said, no, you don't understand. Finally, I said, why don't you really tell me? Well, they weren't hiring Black folks in positions like that in those days. That little company was IBM. Years later, I'm on the Social Responsibility Committee of IBM. And I'm flying from Ithaca, New York with the chairman of IBM on the IBM plane. And I tell him that story. And he says to me, do you remember the name of the person who interviewed you? I said, no. He said, when was that? I tell him. He said, oh yeah, that was when I came into the company. We were doing things like that in those days. But then he said to me, but you've done all right. And I said to him, not as all right as you've done. Yeah, I've done all right for a Black guy, but not as all right as you've done, since you're chairman of IBM now and I'm president of the National Urban League. Yeah, I've done all right, but not as all right as you've done. So that was that experience when coming out of Howard and being a good student, being selected as who's who among students in universities and colleges, meeting my wife there, getting a degree, getting commissioned in the Army, and getting back to DC looking for a job. Well, in sheer desperation, because I didn't get that job at IBM, I hadn't been called for a job in DC. One day in sheer desperation, I got in my car and I drove down to Capitol Hill to see my senator, who was Lyndon Johnson at the time, to see if Lyndon Johnson could help me get a job. One of his aides set out to talk with me and to help me and ask me where had I looked for a job, and I had looked all the way from Commerce to the FBI. And finally he said to me, have you tried the post office? Now, I had not tried the post office because the post office was the job I did not want. Not because it was a bad job, but because I knew a number of Howard University graduates who went to work in the post office and never left. Post office was one of those places where Black folk could get jobs, but once they got there, they tend to not leave there. And I didn't want my career to be one of a career person of the post office. So I said to him, and he said, have you tried the post office? I said, no, but I know the exam is closed. And he said, not to the senator. He picked up the telephone, he made a call. And when he hung up, he said, I want you to go to this address tomorrow. The exam is closed, but the senator chairs the post office committee. So they're gonna give you the exam. I want you to sit there, take the exam, and I want you to sit there and wait for them to score the exam. If you pass, you go to work. Next day I went down, I took the exam. I sat there while they scored it. They came out, I passed it. They told me that I should report to work the next day at the United States Postal Service in Washington, D.C. I am one of the first Postal Post sorting machine operators in the entire United States Post Office system. The post office was just beginning to automate, and they were beginning with parcel posts. And I was in the first class trained to operate the parcel post sorting machine in the United States Post Office in Washington, D.C. And I did that job for 22 months. But it wasn't a job where I wanted to be. And I was looking for, what do I do next? And one day, a guy came through saying his goodbyes. I had known him from his undergraduate days. And I said, where are you going? He said, I got a job at the Department of Public Welfare in Baltimore, Maryland. I didn't have a clue what welfare was. In fact, as poor as I was growing up, I never knew what welfare was. And I didn't know what social work was. The only thing that social work meant to me when I was at Howard in undergraduate school is that the School of Social Work building was next door to the ROTC building. That's the only thing I knew about social work. But he said he had a position, he had a position at the welfare department. And so I said to him, I tell you what, I'll take off tomorrow and drive you to your new job because I want to see where you sign up to take the exam for a job like that. I did. I drove him over there the next day. I signed up to take the exam. I went back a couple of months later. I took the exam. A couple of months after that, I got called for a position at the Department of Public Welfare. I really didn't know what welfare was. But I thought it was a job where I got to wear a suit and tie. And so I accepted the job and I reported to work at the Department of Public Welfare. Now, when I got there, what I discovered after I'd been there a few days is that the Department of Public Welfare in Baltimore was to Morgan University students what the post office was to Howard students. It was where Black graduates from Morgan went to work and they never got out. And I was like, wait a minute, I have exchanged my post office job for a job that is similar to what I was trying to leave, and it's paying me less money. At the post office, I was making $4,800. In this job, I was making $4,040, and I was commuting from DC to Baltimore every day. But after I had been there for a few months, I discovered that the state of Maryland would pay for you to get your graduate degree if you would commit to come back and spend a year for each year you were in grad school. And so I said to some of my coworkers that, oh, I'll just go to grad school. And they said to me, listen, you're really confused. This is not a program for somebody who's been here about 5 months. This is a program for people who've been here 5 or 10 years that they want to make supervisors. I said, well, I'm going to apply anyway. Now, hearkening back to my whole philosophy of wherever you go, try to make an impact. What I figured out at the welfare department is that far too often, people who work in those positions spend their time being policemen of people more than they view themselves as providing a service to people. And so one day I volunteered. I went in and I saw the lady who was in charge of my division. And I said, I noticed that there are all of these cases that are uncovered, which means that people are having to wait to get their money. I want to volunteer to take all of these uncovered cases, and there were 11 uncovered caseloads, averaging 30 cases per case load. I said, I'll take all of these cases. I won't be able to visit all of these people, but I can guarantee them I will get their money out to them. Well, it sounded like a good deal to her because folks were bugging her trying to get their money, and she had no workers to handle these cases. I said, I'll take them all. I took all of these cases, and I made sure that all of these people got their checks on time so they could deal with their needs. My philosophy about social work and welfare is that people in those jobs should not see themselves as the public servants, but should see themselves as society's consultants. They ought to be shaping how society ought to be viewing these issues and concerns. And so I set out to reshape how people viewed people in circumstances like this. Why did I do that? Because I had been one of those people. I knew what it was like to be poor. I knew what it was like to not have money. And I knew that for many of these people, the only issue that really was impacting them was lack of money. And so I wanted to make sure they got their money. And I had one case that I was reading one day, and the previous worker had written in the case, "Do not visit this home. The man is crazy." Put that in the case. So I'm reading this case, and I said to myself, well, how crazy could he be? I said, I'm going to visit this case. Now, this is the early 1960s when Black caseworkers generally were not given white cases. And this was a white family. And they were saying, don't visit him because the man is crazy. So I got in the car and I drove over to his place one day. I knocked on his door. A lady answered through the door, "Who is it?" I said, "I'm the man from the welfare department. I've come to do an appraisal of your situation." She opens the door, she lets me in, she takes me back to this little kitchen, sitting at this little table, and I began to do my evaluation of her situation when all of a sudden she said, "He's coming." I was, "What?" "He's coming." I was like, "Who's coming?" "He's coming." By then he was standing over me, her husband, and he just went into a tirade. He was with the FBI, and he was sent here to investigate the director of the welfare department. He was just going off. So I'm sitting there in this corner, trapped. And what ran through my mind was that, yeah, this man is crazy. Now, how do I get out of here? And he finally said, "And you tell Esther Lazarus," who was the director of the welfare department. When he said that, I stood up with pen in hand, and I said, "I want to take down exactly what you want me to tell her, because when I leave here, I'm going back to the office and I'm going to deliver your message. Tell me what you want me to say." Now, so he told me. That's how I got out of there. But when I went back to the office, I pulled his case record again, and I reread it. And in that record, it said that this man had worked for Bethlehem Steel for over 20 years. So I'm saying to myself, wait a minute. If this man worked for Bethlehem Steel for 20 years, why didn't someone file for his disability benefits? And so I said, I'm going to file for his disability benefits. I did. A few months later, I get a call from the receptionist saying, "There's a Mr. X out here to see you." And I'm trying to remember, who in the world is Mr. X? And finally it occurred to me, it's the crazy man. So I go out to the reception area, and there's this guy standing there, dressed to the nine. I mean, he was clean, suit, tie, hat, highly polished shoes. And I looked at this guy and he said, Mr. Jacob, I just came by today to thank you for what you did for me. He said, I finally got my first disability check. And it wasn't just for 1 month. It was for all the months that I had been entitled to it. It was a lump sum payment for all the months that I had not received it. And so I got all of this money back from my fund, and now I have a monthly income. I don't need welfare anymore. I can take care of my family, and I just wanted to come by and thank you. And it occurred to me, this man wasn't crazy. He was just so stressed out by all of the issues that he was confronting without the ability to deal with them and to finance them, and it was driving him mad. But once that issue got resolved, he was at peace with himself, and he was able to manage his own life and his family's life. There was a lesson to be learned in how you deal with providing the service that your job calls upon you to do. And so I employ any people who are working in positions like that is don't forget why you're in the position, and don't position yourself in a way that you forget that your job is to make that person's life better, not to make that person's life worse. So I got through my graduate school program and go back to the welfare department to pay off my 2 years that I owed them. And as my 2 years were winding down, I started looking for a job in D.C. And because I was still commuting all of this time. And I'm a big time supervisor at the welfare department, supervising in child welfare. And as I looked for a job in DC, I discovered that while I was a big time supervisor with a master's degree, making $5,200 a year, they were paying caseworkers in DC $8,500 to $9,000. So I said, well, I'll just go to DC since I live in DC, and I'll take a caseworker's position. And as I was about to do that, a white girl who had been in my grad school class, who had married a black guy in the class, called me, and we had carpooled together during my grad school days. She called me and she said, Jakey, I know that you're looking for a job in DC. My husband just turned down a job at the Washington Urban League. I thought you might be interested in taking a look at it. I didn't even know what the Urban League was. But I called them up for an appointment. They gave me an appointment. So I went in for an interview. They offered me a job, Director of Education and Youth Incentives, and Director of a project called A Future for Jimmy, paying $8,500. I accept. I go back to Baltimore, I say my goodbyes, and report to work at the Washington Urban League. I was not hired by the president, I was hired by his deputy. The president had never met me, and I had never met the president. So my second day on the job, he knocked on the door, and he said, let's have lunch. Took me across the street to a little place called the Place Where Louis Dwells. Place so dark you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. And his opening statement to me was, well, now that you're here, you better go find the money to pay your salary. I laughed. He said, this is no joke. He said, we may have enough money to carry you for 3 or 4 months, but if you haven't found the money to pay your salary by then, I'm sorry, but you won't be with us. Now I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, I just gave up my supervisor's position, my guaranteed $5,200 a year, to come work for some clown who doesn't have even the money to pay my salary? But I said to myself, I can't go home and tell my wife I'd been that stupid. So I guess I better go out and try to find the money to pay my salary. So I started looking, working with one of the guys who was on the staff, a guy named David Rusk. David was the son of Dean Rusk, who was then the Secretary of State for the US government. And David, who was a very bright guy, had just picked up his master's in economics from UC Berkeley. And David was sort of hanging out in the civil rights movement, young white boy getting involved in the movement, but very bright. And David took me under his wing, and we developed a proposal for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation to ask them to fund this project for $150,000. So I went to Department of Vocational Rehabilitation to sell them on the idea that a person who drops out of school is just as disabled as a person with a physical handicap. My argument was that this person who has dropped out of school is so handicapped that Department of Vocational Rehabilitation ought to be willing to invest some of their funds in making that person job ready. And so I set out to prove that for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and I did. I got $150,000 to do it, and I did it. That's how I got my salary taken care of for those first months that I was with the Washington Urban League. And as I worked my way through that, and one of the dangers of proving that you can do a job with no money in the Urban League is that they keep giving you jobs to do with no money in the Urban League. And so once I was able to demonstrate to vocational rehabilitation that they should be willing to fund making school dropouts employable. And the reason for that is that they can spend unlimited dollars to make a person employable. Once I did that and I was ready to move on, the president of the Washington Urban League came to me and he said, I want you to go to Northern Virginia, to Alexandria, Virginia. I want to spread the Urban League's footprint into Virginia. And I want you to take it out there. I want you to set up an office. I want you to expand our operation. And oh, by the way, I don't have any money to give you to do it. What we will have out there for you is a desk and a telephone, because we have a project out there doing something with employment. But your job is to broaden our span into Northern Virginia. So I show up in Alexandria on my first day with only a telephone and a desk to figure out, what am I going to do to expand the Urban League into this community? And I pick up the local newspaper, the Alexandria Gazette. The sad thing about losing print media is that print media provides a wealth of detailed, researched information that gets lost. Because when I picked up this newspaper, on the front page of Alexandria Gazette was an article that white ministers were meeting in Mount Vernon to discuss the critical issues confronting Northern Virginia. When I saw this article in the paper, I said, okay, I got in my car. I drove to Mount Vernon and crashed their meeting. Well, it shook them up because, first of all, remember it said white ministers. I wasn't white, I'm not a minister, and I wasn't invited. And they said, then why are you here? I said, I saw in the paper that you were going to be discussing critical issues confronting Northern Virginia. And I've come to serve notice that you can't possibly be serious unless you're willing to deal with the fact that there are Black service personnel returning from Vietnam, stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, who can't get housing right outside the gate of that post and are having to commute from Fort Meade, Maryland every day just to come to work. You can't be serious unless you're willing to confront the fact that they can't get housing right outside the gate of Fort Belvoir. So they turned to the white minister in the group who was a Unitarian minister, and they thought Unitarians were crazy anyway. So they turned to John Wells and said, Reverend Wells, would you be willing to work with him on this? John Wells said yes. They said, fine, you go with him. So they dismissed me, they sent him out. So he comes out and he said, what do you want to do? I said, let's go over to Fort Belvoir. I want to challenge the commanding general to take on this issue. Now, I was still active in the Army Reserves. I was a young captain in the Army Reserves, so I knew all the lingo that we use in the military. It turns out that John Wells was not only a Unitarian minister, but he had served in the Air Force, and he was also a lawyer, and he was a JAG officer in the Air Force, had gone to Emory University and got his law degree, but went to Howard School of Divinity. And so I said to John Wells, come with me. Let's go over to Fort Belvoir. I want to challenge this general to take on this issue. So we literally crashed the general's office at Fort Belvoir. And so the general, I said to the general, his name was Robert Seedlock. I said, General, I understand that this is not your problem because housing on the base is integrated. But I also know that you cannot accommodate all of the people who work on this base with housing. And I know that there are Black service personnel stationed at Fort Belvoir having to commute every day from Fort Meade, Maryland, because they simply can't get housing right outside your gate. And I said, I know that a commander is responsible for everything his men do or fail to do, and thus you must be concerned about the fact that your personnel stationed at your base can't get housing right outside your post. He said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? I said, I tell you what, why don't you invite all the property owners and managers for lunch at your officers club, and let me help you write your speech. You know, okay, we can do that. And so he invited all these folks to the officers club at Fort Belvoir, and we helped him write his speech. And his speech went something like this. One of the first men to be considered for the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War was a Black man. And he wasn't considered for that honor because of what he did for Black service personnel, but for what he did for all of his brothers in arms. But if you want to dismiss us on that, consider this, that we protect the land in which your property exists. But if you want to dismiss us on that, consider this. Every year, Fort Belvoir dumps $200 million into the Northern Virginia economy, and just like we put it there, we can take it out. The next day, 1,500 units of housing opened up. When that happened, there was a guy at the Pentagon by the name of Frank Bonnemore, an attorney, who knew John Wells. He called John Wells to ask, what the hell did you guys do to get them to open up that housing? So John Wells and I go over to the Pentagon and we sit with this guy and we lay out for him what we did. 3 or 4 months later, Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, issued a pronouncement that said, any housing around military installations that won't rent or sell to Black service personnel will be placed off limits to all military personnel. When that began to happen, housing all around military installations began to open up.
And around what year was that?
1966. And after that episode, I was soon brought back into D.C. to become the deputy to the president. And then Dr. King was assassinated on April 4, 1968. And I remember I was at a fundraising report meeting at All Saints Episcopal Church, collecting monies for our membership campaign, when the word came that Dr. King had been shot. And I mean, that was the biggest shock that I think any of the people in that room had heard in our lifetime. I mean, I grew up in the South, so I knew about lynching. I knew about segregation. I knew about oppression. I knew about the fact that Black folks had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. Two things my father always had: his poll tax receipt and his NAACP card. I mean, two things he always had. I knew how oppressive the South was. And I knew how mean some white folks were. But the thing about growing up in the South in my day, being surrounded by racist white folks, you also got an opportunity to see how bright or how less bright they were. You were invisible to them, but they were a study of sociology to you. And I knew that they weren't better than I was, because I was watching them. I was observing them. And I knew that they didn't have the ambition that I had. They didn't have the motivation that I had. And they didn't have the bravery that I had to make it in life. Because for them, it was already made for them. I remember something Lyndon Johnson once said. Lyndon Johnson said that if you can show the lowest white man that he is better than the best colored man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. He said, hell, if you can show him there's somebody he can look down on, he'll even empty his pockets for you. I mean, I knew the level of how white folks perceive Black folks. And so I was not intimidated by them, even though I knew that they didn't have a lot of respect for me. And so as I set out to deal with and process this whole thing about Dr. King being shot, it didn't surprise me that he had been shot. What had surprised me is that he hadn't gotten shot long ago, because what they were doing was challenging what America really said she stood for. And America has not really ever thought that when they talked about a more perfect union, they were talking about inclusiveness. They were talking about a more perfect union for them. And how could we make life more comfortable for them? And so I was not shocked with Dr. King's assassination. I was concerned about all of us who worked in that arena. The next day was when Stokely Carmichael, who later became Toure, Stokely led a march from Howard University's campus. And that march turned into a riot because there were a lot of angry Black folks who had that pinned up hostility all of their lives. They had seen and felt the brutalization of themselves and their families. But the interesting thing about that riot is that poor people got blamed for burning the town down. The Urban League, the Washington Urban League, and by the way, I want to say that Sterling Tucker, who was president of the Washington Urban League, was one of the brightest guys I've ever worked for. I mean, he was just flat out smart. And he figured out a role for the Washington Urban League to play in this riot. And the role he carved out for us is that we would run rumor control centers. And the value of rumor control centers in a riot is that what fuel riots are rumors. And if you have folks who can filter the rumor and take fact from fiction and then put it out there, it will moderate what is going on. And so we were running rumor control centers, and I was running one at 6 and G Northwest DC. And I would see at night, under the cloud of darkness, young Black folks taking this town apart. When the riots, and by the way, the first day the riot caught America off guard. And people just did what they chose to do. But I said to anybody who would listen, you only get to do that once. Don't try that a second day, because the second day, they will be prepared for you. And the second day, they brought the army out. And after the riots had died down, Sterling Tucker pulled together a small group of board members and a small group of staff to take a look at what had we learned from this riot. And as we sat around the fireplace at Dr. Lena Ware's home, I could listen to folks saying, poor people burn the town down. And I finally said, wait a minute, poor people didn't burn this town down. It is true that poor people went shopping because it was the Easter season. So they took advantage of that. I mean, they went shopping, but they weren't the ones who burned this town down. I said, the people who burned this town down, because I was out there observing what was going on, were the young, smart, college student types who had read what the Constitution said, who knew what the Bill of Rights had promised, who knew what democracy was supposed to be about, and who knew that America was not living up to its creed. And so they decided that they would just take this country apart because of that. I said, now the lesson for the Urban League is that we have to bring our processes in line with their impatience. We have to bring we're moving too slow for them. We have to bring our processes in line with their impatience. Sterling Tucker said, that sounds like a new thrust. He went to Whitney Young and he sold Whitney on the notion that we should build this new thrust around bringing our processes in line with the impatience of those young people out there. And so that began to create a whole new environment in the Urban League. Sterling Tucker took a leave of absence from the Washington Urban League to head up this new thrust project. And I became the acting president of the Washington Urban League. And the first thing I did was to throw a picket line around the government printing office. Well, the Urban League didn't picket. I mean, that was not our thing. But I put a picket line around the government printing office because Black employees at the government printing office had been coming to see the Urban League about the fact that they had been there for years doing the job, and then they would bring in some young white boy that they would have to teach the job, who would then become their supervisor. And so I put this picket line around the government printing office, and the public printer finally sent for me to see what we could do, what he could do to get this picket line from around his building. And because he didn't see that he had any problems.
Yeah.
He didn't understand what this issue that I had manufactured was all about. And I said to him, look, I mean, scores of your employees have been to see me. I said, and I know that you have employees setting fires to skids of paper on the floor right beneath you. And I live with the fear of one day them burning that floor that you're sitting on down from under you. That's when it came, he knew that I knew what was going on. And I said, you've got to readjust how you deal with the people you have in your employment. And so as I began to break down some of the barriers that government didn't feel it was accountable to anybody, including the people who worked for them. I mean, government operated like these were plantations. White folks were in charge, and Black folks brought the bodies to get the work done. And so we began to address that. Well, we went through about 18 months of me being the acting president of the Washington Urban League. But every time I would have a board meeting to give an accounting of what was going on during my leadership of the Washington Urban League, the entire meeting was also one spent around, when is Sterling coming back? And this went on meeting after meeting after meeting. And I finally got tired of hearing it. So at one of those meetings, I finally said, you know, I don't know when Sterling is coming back. But what I do know is that I don't know if I want to work for you any longer. I said, every month I sit before you to give an accounting of what we are doing, and you don't hear anything that I'm saying that means to me that I am invisible to you, and you're fixated on when is Sterling coming back. So I think you ought to deal with getting Sterling to come back. Well, I got an interesting response to that. One of them said, oh, we didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you say something sooner? But then they said, we're sending a letter to Sterling that he has to decide if he's going to stay with the National Urban League. And if not, he has to come back and give us a date certain. Well, Sterling wasn't going to leave Washington, and neither did I expect him to leave Washington, because Washington was his power base. And there were two things that Sterling desired. One was to be mayor of Washington, and two was to be president of the National Urban League. And so when they gave him a choice, an ultimatum, decide whether you're going to stay with National or if you're going to come back to the Washington Urban League. I knew he was going to come back to the Washington Urban League. So when he came back, the second day he was back, I walked into his office and I gave him my resignation. And he said, Jake, you don't have to leave. I'll only be here for another couple of years, and all this will be yours. I said, Sterling, this is not a kingdom that you get to hand down. This is not yours to give. I said, secondly, I never based my career on what the other guy might do. But also, thirdly, this is your urban league. You built it. You're entitled to come back. I'm not leaving because you're coming back. I'm leaving because I now know that I can be a president of an urban league. Mm. And I know this urban league can't afford 2 presidents. And he said, but Jake, I'll pay you the same money that I pay me. I said, Sterling, the urban league can't afford to pay me the same money that it paid you. I mean, this is not personal. I understand that this is your urban league. I just know it's time for me to move on. Now, I didn't have a clue where I was going to go. But as I was in the process of doing that, a couple of local urban leaguers walked into my office and they said, we would like for you to build a program to train community organizers for each of our local affiliates. I had sort of gotten a reputation for being a hotshot community organizer. And they said, we want you to build a program and train community organizers for us. And what we're going to do, we're going to go to Sterling Tucker and demand that all the money that he had set aside to fund projects in the Eastern region, we want him to consolidate all of those dollars, give them to you to train community organizers for our local affiliates. So they made that demand of Sterling. He agreed to do it. So I agreed to train community organizers. So I put together a school training community organizers for each of the 24 local affiliates. And while I was in the process of doing that, one day I get a telephone call. I'm compulsive about time. I'm the kind of guy who shows up. I'm the first guy in the office, the last guy to leave. It doesn't matter what position I hold. I'm always first and last. So I was in the office early one morning, phone ring, I pick up the phone, and a voice came on that said, is this John Jacob? I said, yeah. Are you in your office? I said, yeah. You gonna be there? I said, yeah. Good, I'm coming to see you. And I said, well, who are you? He said, I'm Henry H. Hill from San Diego, and hung up. So he shows up with his Japanese wife, black guy, and he said, I'm Henry Hill from San Diego. I've come to tell you why you have to come to San Diego and run the Urban League. I don't need to hear you talk because I've heard you. I want you to just listen to me. So he rattled off all of this stuff, why I had to come and what he would be able to do for me. And then he gets up and leaves. So I called the guy who had been at the San Diego Urban League and who had recently taken the Westchester County Urban League. And I called him up and I said, hey, John, this guy just left my office telling me why I had to come to San Diego. And he said, who was it? And I told him. He said, whatever he promised you, he can deliver. Mm. And so, but I wasn't interested in going to San Diego. And that summer, the National Urban League Conference was in New York. And I went to the conference. A delegation of people from San Diego came to meet with me and demanded that I come and sit with them. Now, I had no plans of going to San Diego, but there were guys who wanted to go to San Diego. Mm-hmm. So I said to them, look, I'm not interested in the job, but what I will do, I will go in and meet with them and I will run the salary up for you. And so I went in and I sat with them, and they asked me to outline for them all the things I thought should be done with the San Diego Urban League. And I laid out all these things that I thought they needed to do. And one little lady named Carolyn Murdoch said, "Mr. Jacob, how much would it cost to get you to come and do that?" Now, I was making $38,000 at the Washington Urban League, but the guy that left San Diego had only been making $18,000. And so I thought, since they asked me what would it cost, since I wasn't interested, since I knew some guys who were, I said, "Madam, I don't even hold a discussion for less than $25,000. And she said, "We'll just have to find the money to pay you." So I leave the meeting and I go outside, the other guys who are waiting to be interviewed. And as I passed them, I said, "Hey guys, I got the salary up to $25,000 for you." And I leave. I get back to DC and I get a call from San Diego asking me to come and take a look at their city. And at first I agreed to do it. But after I hung the phone up, I said to myself, that is very unethical. You have no interest, no intention of taking a job. And they don't have money to blow on just bringing somebody out for an interview. And so I pick up the phone and I call them right back. And I say, "I can't be that unethical. I'm not interested. So I won't let you spend your money on me like that." And they said, "It's our money. We'll take the chance." Now my conscience is clear. So they send me a ticket and I get on a plane and I fly out to San Diego. Now it's August in DC. It's gotta be 1,000 degrees. And they pick me up at the airport in San Diego, take me to this hotel sitting out on the Pacific Ocean. They open up the sliding glass doors. They didn't even have the air conditioning on. And that breeze blows in and I'm thinking, you know what, wait a minute. This may not be a bad place to hang your hat. I said, I think I'll reconsider about taking this job. So the next morning when I met with them, I said, I'll make a deal with you. I hadn't planned to accept this job. And I know that I gave a number of 25,000. I'm already making 38,000. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll agree to take the job for $25,000. If you will agree, when I raise more money, you will pay me more money. And they said, "You got a deal." So I go back and I pack up to go to San Diego. Now my wife really didn't want to go to San Diego. And I said to her, "Well, I'm going. You make up your mind." I packed up my car and I drove out to San Diego. I arrived in San Diego on a weekend and on an early Sunday morning, check into the hotel that I'd stayed in when I was there for the interview. And the next morning I get up and I called up the guy that I'd had find me an apartment. And I called him up and asked him where was this apartment he had found for me. He told me, gave me directions. I drove to my new apartment. And I did not see another Black person that entire weekend. And so that Monday morning, the first thing that I did was to go looking for the Black community in San Diego. I had not planned to go to work that week. I just planned to scope out San Diego because I wasn't supposed to report until the following week. But I finally found the office And as I sat in my office in the building, I observed that people hardly ever came to work on time. So I just sat there and I watched folks being very cavalier about how they came in and out of the office. And so I said to them, I said to one of the secretaries, I want you to assemble all of the employees, and I want to have a conversation with them. And I'd observed them all week, how they were in and out. This Friday, she got them all together. And I said to them, you know, this is not the way I operate. If you have noticed, I have been in this office every day this week before you. I'm not even on the payroll this week. I have been here every week, and I have been here when the day ended. So I know when you come, I know when you go. And I don't operate that way. Let me tell you how I operate. If you want to be a part of my team, first you got to come to work. 2, you got to deliver, because I deliver where I work. Now, if you don't want to work here, my feelings won't be hurt. It's not personal. So here's what I want you to do. Over the weekend, I want you to decide if you want to be a part of this team. And if you don't, we can still be friends. But if you show up, here's what my expectations are. I'll see you on Monday. Monday, everybody showed up on time. And so my run in San Diego was a very interesting one, because I set very high standards for myself, and I hold people working with me and for me to those same standards. And so as we began to go down the road to try to create the kind of urban league that I thought we should have, the kind of force in the community that I thought we could be, I wanted some troops who understood that we don't play with people's lives. We make their lives better. And so one of the things that had happened before I got to San Diego is that there had been a war between the Black Panther organization in San Diego and the US organization in San Diego. And when I say war, they had a shootout between the groups. And one of the Panthers was killed. And the US organization went underground, but they emerged from underground as the National Involvement Association. And they controlled Southeast San Diego. Well, I'm too stupid to be controlled. And so as I began to run my organization, one of the things that I observed is that the largest program in the San Diego Urban League was run by a guy who was also a city councilman. He was the Urban League's employee, but he was also a city councilman, and he had been fundamentally placed on that in that city council seat by the forces of Black folks in Southeast San Diego. So he was their guy, but he worked for the Urban League. And so I made a request of him to come to my office, to bring his books, and to take me through his program and let me take a look at his budget. Because his budget was bigger than the Urban League's budget. And as an old Army officer, I always felt that I was responsible for everything that was in my portfolio. Well, he didn't show up for the appointment. So I said, maybe I'm approaching this wrong. So I called his office and made an appointment to come to his office. And then I went down for my meeting with him. And when I got there, his secretary said he left. I said, he knew I was coming? She said, yeah. And he left? Yeah. I said, then tell him he doesn't have to come back because he's fired. Well, I fired him. And chaos, exploded. First, he sued me and the Urban League. I'm too stupid to even be frightened by this. So I just asked, who's the best defense attorney in town? They gave me a name. I went over and retained him. But the other thing that happened was that his people called the United Way and asked the United Way to defund the Urban League. And I got a call from the president of the United Way informing me that this request had been made and they were not going to take sides. They were going to be neutral. They were just going to hold up my increase. And I said, well, the only thing being neutral to you means is who you neutral against. Mm. If you holding up my increase, you're not neutral. Or you neutral against me. Mm-hmm. But I said, you do what you have to do, and I'll do what I have to do. Well, there was a guy on the San Diego Urban League board who was sort of like the chief operating officer of the Naval Air Rework Facility on North Island, which was the largest naval installation in the San Diego area. And he was on the board of the Urban League. So I called him up. And I told him I needed a favor. He said, what's the favor? I said, I would like for you to hold up the combined federal campaign funds from North Island to the United Way. And I explained to him what they had just informed me of. And he said, okay. Then I get a call from the president of the United Way. Did you hold up my funding from North Island? I said, yeah. He said, why? I said, well, I told you if you do what you had to do, I would do what I have to do. And he said, I'll call you back. So he called me back and he said, I've set up a meeting with you and the board of the United Way. And I said, okay. So when I informed the board that this meeting was being set up, one of my board members, who was a retired Army colonel, said, I'll go with you. And so the next morning we show up, but I get there first. And when he gets there, he comes over to me and he said, do you have your piece with you? And I said, well, I have one in my car. He said, I'm taking mine in with me. So I go back to my car. I get my piece, and I go in the meeting. These guys come in. They're wearing dashikis and bandoliers of bullets. Right? They're wearing bandoliers, they're wearing dashikis, they're carrying bandoliers in their hands, and they come in screaming. And their leader yells out, there were 2 black people on the United Way board. Their leader yells out to the woman who's on the United Way board, who ran the other big agency in San Diego. And he said, Ruby, don't be a bitch all your life. Tell these white folks to get out of here. This is black folks' business. Then he walks over to the black guy on the board, whose name really was Tom. And he said, Tom, don't be an Uncle Tom all your life. Tell these white folks to get out of here. This is black folks' business. He slams the table. Now, sitting around that table are these nice little old white ladies. There's a Marine colonel and a Navy captain sitting at this table. And I'm watching the captain and the colonel, how they are viewing this. And I could read their minds. They were saying, oh, now, if we weren't sitting at this table, I would deal with this. But I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going to let this guy parade all around this room. But he better not cross that line. Because I'm going to assume that he's dangerous if he does. And he doesn't know just how dangerous I can be. And so he's parading around the room, he's ranting, he slammed this table, and the table crumbles. These little old ladies are shook. Somebody had called the police. The police comes in, a black guy from the sheriff department, a black guy from the police department. And they come in and they carry them out. They carry the leader out and the rest of them follow. President of United Way comes over to me and he said, we don't need to hear from you. We see what you're dealing with. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of this. I go back to my office and these 2 police officers show up. And they say to me, Mr. Jacob, we know that you were armed in that meeting. And the reason we know that you were armed in that meeting is that it's been a long time since we've seen a .38 that large. So we're going to do 2 things for you. One, we're going to get you a concealed weapons permit because we see what you're dealing with. We're going to get you one so you can carry. And 2, we're going to suggest where you can get a smaller .38. And so, but the other thing that happened in that process is that I had gotten 2 large programs funded by the Model Cities program. And one day, the guy who ran the Model Cities program walked in my office and told me they were taking the programs from me. Not for non-performance, but because I had fired this city councilman. And I said to him, okay, that's what you choose to do, but I'm not leaving town. And this town will be begging me to take those programs before I leave. And so we lost 2 programs because I fired this guy. By the way, now they withdrew their suit the second day of trial because my lawyer said to me, you need to go to that office and find something that we can work with. And I uncovered some documents that looked like he had accepted money from some real estate person on a deal, on a vote that he had to make. And so when my lawyer saw that, my lawyer informed his lawyer that we would publicly make known this information. So if they wanted to continue with this trial, feel free to do so, but know that we will put in the press this pay to play that it looked like he's engaging in. They withdrew the suit the second day. Mm-hmm. But I went through my San Diego period from buying shopping center, that shopping center where the war had taken place between us and the Black Panthers. I bought it for the Urban League. The monies that Model Cities was giving out to organizations for swimming pools and gyms, I went to them and asked them for money to buy 18 acres of land that was a couple of blocks down the street from my office. And they said, what are you going to do with it? I said, we're going to develop a commercial and industrial park on that land. If you go to San Diego today and look for Costco on Market Street, that was the land that I bought, that a commercial and industrial park was built around. So we had a rather successful 5 years in San Diego. And the reason I ended up leaving San Diego, frankly, was that San Diego was the kind of town that you can get comfortable and start acting like you're in retirement. It's a retirement environment.
Yeah.
And I felt I was too young to be acting like I was in retirement. And so I needed to figure out what I was going to do next. And what came up was that Sterling Tucker, when D.C. got home rule, Sterling Tucker ran for president of the D.C. City Council and won. So I get a call from the Washington Urban League wanting me to apply for the president position of the Washington Urban League. And I said, I will not apply for a job that I spent 18 months doing. That if they're interested in me, then they need to make me an offer because I won't apply. And so I then received a fax setting up an appointment for me to be interviewed by the search committee. I picked up the telephone and called him back. I said, I told you, I will not subject myself to an application process for this job. I have a job, so I'm not looking for a job. And I'm happy in my job. I said, if they want me, they need to make me an offer. Mm-hmm. And so I got a call back that says, we know you're going to be in D.C. because I was on Howard University's Board of Trustees then.
Okay.
It said, we know you're going to be in D.C. for a Howard board meeting. Would you be willing to have lunch with us and tell us the things that you think we should do in order to get this Urban League moving forward now that Sterling is gone? And I said, sure, I'll have lunch with you. So when I was in D.C., I went over to have lunch with him. And after the lunch, one of the board members said, John, what would it take to get you to come and do this job? And I said, make me an offer. And if I like your offer, I will consider it. So I left. I went back to San Diego. They called me with an offer. And I was debating whether I was going to take it when the guy who ran the Model Cities program, the Model Cities program ended, and the mayor kept all of the senior administrators of the Model Cities program but him. And so he came to see me, and this is the same guy who took the programs from me. He was lamenting about the fact that he didn't know what he was going to do, that he didn't want to leave San Diego. He had his wife had a new baby, they had a new child. He said to me, I may even just start skycapping at the airport. Mm. And I said to him, now I knew this guy from D.C. He was an instructor at Howard University when I was an undergraduate, and he had married a girl from my hometown, from Houston. So I knew him. We weren't close friends, but I knew him. And he was the only guy in San Diego from the East Coast that I did know. So I said to him, you know what? I've been offered this job in D.C. I suspect if I were to take the job in D.C., I could convince my board to take you in as its president. Now, that was a hard sell because I didn't particularly like him, and the board chair didn't like him. But I sold the Urban League on him for the new president. Let me just hasten to add, I have not made many big mistakes, but that was one of them, by convincing that board that they should hire that guy for that job, because he turned out to be a disaster in that job. But I go back to DC, and what young people need to understand is that whenever you take on a new leadership position, there's somebody there who thought they should have had the job. And so one of your first challenges is to demonstrate to that person why you were selected and they weren't. Because when I went back to the Washington Urban League, there was this lady on the board, on the staff, who had great credentials. She too had a master's degree. She too had been working in the Urban League. She was competent in her profession. And she had offered to take the job at a price less than what I was willing to take the job. And yet they selected me. And so I knew that when I arrived back in that position, one of the first things I had to do was to make a statement to her as to why I was selected and she wasn't. And so the first thing that I did, my first week there, I started rummaging through desk drawers and through files to see what had happened in the 5 years that I had been gone from the Washington Urban League. And in my rummaging through the files, there stood out a proposal that had been written by a woman by the name of Linda Finkelstein, who was on the staff when I was there. Very bright, very good writer. She had written this proposal, and it was just laying there in the desk drawer. Linda Finkelstein was, when Sterling Tucker went to the DC government as president of the DC City Council, she followed him into DC government. And she was working in a department that this proposal fell under their jurisdiction. So I called her up. And I said, I got a proposal here that I know you're gonna love, that I'd love to get funded. And she said, well, tell me about the proposal. So I started telling her about the proposal. She said, that proposal sounds familiar to me. I said, well, it should, you wrote it. I got that proposal funded in the first week I was there, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000, $500,000. Now I did that to make a statement as to that's why I'm here and you're not in this position, because this proposal has just been laying here all of this time and nobody bothered to do anything with it. And so that's how I moved back into the District of Columbia.